The corridor smelled like something between crushed lavender and burning copper, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and walk the other way. But I kept moving, dress uniform pressed, boots polished to a shine that reflected the crystalline walls around me, and a diplomatic badge pinned to my chest that might as well have read, "Nobody important." My name is Cale Maddox, Sergeant, Earth Unified Forces, attached to the 14th Logistics Division, which is a very fancy way of saying I change oil on transport rigs and pull overnight guard shifts on cargo ships. 3 weeks ago, someone at command decided they needed a warm body to represent humanity at the most important alien wedding in a century. They picked me, not because I was qualified, because I was available. The Vathari Dominion had extended an invitation to every species in the Galactic Compact. 42 civilizations sent ambassadors, dignitaries, and cultural envoys dressed in silks and metals I could not even name. Earth sent me. A logistics sergeant with no political training, no diplomatic experience, and a service record so unremarkable that my own commanding officer had to look up my file before signing the deployment order. I was told to stand where they told me to stand, smile when protocol required it, and under no circumstances do anything that would end up in a headline. Simple enough. I had done boring jobs before. But this did not feel boring. It felt wrong. I noticed it within the first 10 minutes of walking through the royal palace of House Vorani. The guards were not positioned along the outer perimeter where you would expect them. They were clustered at interior choke points, doorways, and junction corridors. That is not how you defend against an outside threat. That is how you control movement inside a building. I had spent enough time on security rotations to know the difference, and the difference was making the hair on my arms stand up. The palace itself was stunning in a way that made me feel very small and very out of place. The walls were grown, not built, from a mineral the Vathari called lysynthite. It looked like frozen lightning, pale blue and white, with veins of gold running through it like rivers seen from orbit. The ceilings arched 60 feet above my head, carved with the faces of ancient Vathari monarchs, whose names I could not pronounce. Every surface caught light and scattered it into fragments that danced across the floor like living things. It was beautiful. It was also the kind of beauty that reminded you, very quietly, that you did not belong here. A Vathari courtier found me standing near a pillar, probably looking exactly as lost as I felt. He was tall, the way all Vathari were tall, nearly 7 feet, with skin the color of dark amber, and those distinctive silver-flecked eyes that made every Vathari look like they were studying you from a great distance, even when they were standing right next to you. His name was Counselor Idrath, and he spoke Terran Standard with the careful precision of someone who had learned it from textbooks and never once used it in casual conversation. "Sergeant Maddox," he said, inclining his head in a gesture I had been briefed was roughly equivalent to a handshake. "You are the Terran representative for the right of witness." I told him I was, though I had only the vaguest understanding of what that meant. My briefing packet had been 12 pages long, and 11 of those pages were about which fork to use at dinner. Idrath explained it to me as we walked toward the main ceremonial hall. The right of witness was one of the oldest traditions in Vathari culture, dating back over 9,000 years to the founding of the Dominion. During a royal wedding, every attending species was required to provide a living shield, one representative who would stand directly behind the bride during the blood vow ceremony, symbolizing the galaxy's commitment to protecting the Union. It was symbolic, purely ceremonial. The shield-bearer carried no weapon, wore no armor, and had no role beyond standing still and looking respectful for approximately 1 hour. "You will be positioned within arm's reach of Princess Selara," Idrath said, and something in his tone shifted just slightly. "You will remain there until the vow is sealed." I asked him if there was anything else I needed to know. He paused. It was a brief pause, the kind most people would not notice. But I had spent 6 years reading body language on cargo docks and checkpoint lines, and I noticed. He was deciding whether to tell me something. Then the moment passed, and he simply said, "Stand still." That is all. I did not push it. I was a guest in someone else's house, on someone else's world, at someone else's wedding. Whatever politics were swirling beneath the surface of this event, they were not mine to untangle. The ceremonial hall was the largest enclosed space I had ever stood inside. It made cathedrals look like closets. The ceiling was a dome of transparent lysantite, and through it, I could see the violet sky of the Vathari homeworld streaked with the silver trails of orbital platforms. Thousands of guests filled the tiered seating, representatives from dozens of species, each delegation in their own cultural dress. The Kesrani wore living armor that pulsed with bioluminescence. The Thoravaks delegation was encased in environmental suits that hummed with a low vibration I could feel in my teeth. The Peleni had sent a single representative who was 9 feet tall and appeared to be made entirely of polished obsidian. And then there was me, one human in a green dress uniform, standing in a line of 41 other shield-bearers from 41 other worlds, about to take a position behind a princess I had never met. The procession began with music. Not music the way humans understand it. Vathari ceremonial music was generated by resonance crystals embedded in the walls, and it did not so much play as it moved through you. Low frequencies that vibrated in your chest, and high harmonics that seemed to come from inside your own skull. It was disorienting and beautiful at the same time. Princess Selara Vorani entered from the eastern arch, and the entire hall went silent. She was not what I expected. The briefing materials had included a formal portrait that made her look austere and distant, the way official photographs always do. In person, she was younger than I had imagined, and there was a sharpness to her features that the portrait had not captured. Her skin was the same dark amber as every Vathari I had seen, but her eyes were different. Not silver-flecked like the others. Hers were violet, deep and vivid, like the sky above us compressed into something you could look directly into. She wore ceremonial robes of white and gold that trailed behind her for 15 feet, and she moved with the kind of practiced grace that comes from a lifetime of being watched. I took my position behind her as the shield-bearers arranged themselves in a crescent formation. My spot put me close enough that I could have reached out and touched her shoulder. I did not, obviously. I stood still, kept my expression neutral, and did what I had been told to do. I was furniture. Background. The human-shaped placeholder that Earth had sent because the invitation required a body, and I was the body they could spare. The groom entered next. Lord Draven of House Kalith, tall even by Vathari standards, with sharp features and eyes that were almost black. He moved like someone who had already decided how this day was going to end. I had seen that walk before. On base, we called it the command stride. It was the walk of a person who believed that everything happening around them was already under their control. His hands were steady. That was the thing that bothered me most. Here was a man about to marry the most powerful woman in a dominion of 800 billion souls, and his hands were perfectly, unnaturally steady. No tremor, no twitch, no sign of emotion at all. In my experience, people who are that calm in high-pressure situations are either monks or predators, and Lord Draven did not strike me as a man who spent much time in prayer. The blood vow began. I will not pretend I understood the words. The ceremony was conducted in High Vathari, a formal dialect that my translator implant could only partially render. What I did understand were the gestures. The bride and groom each cut their palms with a ceremonial blade and pressed their hands together, mingling blood in a bond that was considered sacred and unbreakable. The crowd watched in reverent silence. Several Vathari in the front rows were weeping openly. I should have been watching the ceremony. That was my job. Stand still, look respectful, and watch the ceremony. Instead, I was watching the guards. 3 of them had shifted positions since the procession began. Not dramatically, not in any way that would draw attention, but they had moved from the flanking positions near the eastern and western arches to a tighter formation closer to the royal family's seating area. It was subtle, professional, and it was a classic cordon pattern, the kind you set up when you want to isolate a specific group of people from the rest of a crowd. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this was an alien culture, with alien protocols, and I was projecting human military patterns onto something I did not understand. I told myself to stop scanning the room and start acting like the ceremonial prop I was supposed to be. Then the princess glanced back at me. It was quick, less than a second. A flick of those violet eyes over her shoulder that no one else in the hall would have caught, but I was standing right behind her, and I caught it perfectly. And what I saw in that look was not curiosity, not annoyance, not the mild confusion of a princess wondering why the human was fidgeting during her wedding. It was fear. Not fear of me. Fear of what was about to happen. The kind of fear you see in someone who knows the ground is about to give way beneath their feet and has no way to stop it. I had seen that look in combat zones. I had seen it on the faces of civilians who heard the sirens a half-second before the shelling started. Princess Selara Vorani, on the day of her royal wedding, surrounded by thousands of guests and dozens of guards, and the full ceremonial weight of a 9,000-year-old empire, was terrified. And in that moment, standing in a palace made of frozen lightning on a world 52 light-years from everything I knew, I felt the old instinct wake up. The one they trained into you at boot camp and never fully explained. The one that does not care about protocol or politics, or the fact that you are just a logistics sergeant who changes oil for a living. The one that simply says, very clearly and very calmly, something is about to go wrong, and you need to be ready. I adjusted my weight onto the balls of my feet. I mapped the nearest exit. I identified 3 objects within arm's reach that could be used as improvised cover, and I kept my eyes on the guards who were no longer standing where guards should stand. The ceremony continued. The music swelled. The blood vow reached its climax. And I waited. The lights went out at the exact moment Lord Draven released the princess's hand. That was how I knew it was coordinated. Not a malfunction, not an accident, not some ancient fuse blowing in a 9,000-year-old palace. The timing was surgical. The vow had reached the moment of final declaration, where the officiant would pronounce the union sealed and binding. One more sentence, and the marriage would have been law. But that sentence never came, because the hall dropped into absolute blackness, and the first shot turned the silence into chaos. I did not see where the bolt came from. I heard it, a sharp, crackling hiss that cut through the darkness like a blade through silk, followed by an impact sound that was unmistakable if you had ever heard it before. The sound of a high-energy projectile hitting a living body, wet and final. Someone screamed. Then everyone screamed. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, a dull amber glow that turned the crystalline walls into a hellscape of long shadows and fractured reflections. And in that ugly light, I saw the king of the Vathari Dominion slumped sideways in his throne, with a hole through his chest the size of my fist. The queen beside him was clutching her shoulder where a second bolt had clipped her, and blood the color of dark copper was running between her fingers. I did not think. Thinking takes too long. I grabbed the princess by the shoulder and pulled her down behind the stone base of the altar. She was rigid with shock, her eyes wide, her mouth open but silent. 3 more shots hit the altar above our heads, spraying fragments of lysanthite that stung like broken glass. The shooters were on the balconies. 3 of them, maybe 4, firing from elevated positions with clear lines of sight to the royal seating area. This was not an assassination. This was an execution drill. Planned, practiced, and precise. Through the smoke and the strobing emergency lights, I saw Lord Draven. He had stepped away from the altar with a calm, measured stride. No surprise on his face. No shock, no fear, no confusion. He was walking backward toward the eastern arch, and 2 of the guards who had repositioned earlier were flanking him, weapons drawn, clearing his path. He had known. He had stood at that altar, pressed his hand against hers, spoken words of union and fidelity, and the entire time he had known that the moment the vow was almost complete, his people would turn the lights off and start killing her family. The princess saw it too. I watched her track Draven's retreat across the hall, and something in her expression shifted from shock into something harder and colder. She said one word in Vathari that my translator rendered as traitor, but the tone carried a weight that no translation could capture. More shots. The guests were stampeding toward the exits, trampling each other in the dark. Several of the shield-bearers from other species were down, either hit or crushed in the panic. The Kesrani representative was returning fire with a sidearm nobody had noticed she was carrying. The Pellini delegate had flipped an entire stone bench onto its side and was using it as cover for a group of cowering dignitaries. I needed a weapon. There was a royal guard 5 feet to my left. He was not going to need his weapon anymore. I reached him in 2 seconds, pulled the pulse pistol from his holster, and rolled back behind the altar. The gun was alien. Heavier than what I was used to, with a grip designed for fingers longer than mine, and a trigger mechanism that I had to feel my way through in the dark. But the basic physics of a firearm do not change across species. Point the dangerous end at the threat. Squeeze until something happens. I rose above the altar line and fired 3 shots at the nearest balcony position. The first went wide. The second hit the railing. The third hit the shooter, and he dropped. The recoil was different from what I was trained on, sharper and more vertical. But I adjusted on the second pull and held my grouping tight after that. Return fire came fast, concentrated on my position. I pulled the princess lower, pressing her flat against the stone floor, and felt a bolt pass so close to my head that it singed the hair above my right ear. The heat of it was immediate and startling, like opening an oven door with your face too close. I laid down suppressive fire, not aimed, not precise, just enough rounds in enough directions to make the shooters duck and buy time. 90 seconds. That was all I was trying to buy. 90 seconds for the surviving members of the royal family to reach the evacuation corridors that I had spotted during my walk through the palace. 90 seconds for someone with more authority and more firepower than a logistics sergeant with a stolen gun to take control of the situation. The queen was dragged to safety by 2 loyalist guards. A handful of nobles from the royal seating area made it to the western arch. Most did not. The hall was littered with fallen Vathari, some moving, some still, and the beautiful crystalline walls were scorched with black streaks from pulse fire. When the shooting finally paused, either because the attackers were repositioning or because they had run out of easy targets, I pulled the princess to her feet and moved. "Stay behind me," I said. "Move when I move, stop when I stop." She looked at me. Her robes were torn. There was blood on her face, not hers, debris from the altar. Her violet eyes were still wide, but the shock was fading, and what was replacing it was something I recognized: focus. The sharp, narrow focus of someone who has decided they are not going to die today. "I know a way out," she said. Her voice was steady, barely. "Then lead," I said. "I will cover." We ran. Behind us, the ceremonial hall of the Vathari Dominion burned. The marriage that was supposed to end a war had started one instead, and the only person who had moved to protect the princess, the only body between her and the bullets, was a human sergeant that no one had bothered to search at the door. The catacombs beneath the palace were older than the palace itself. Princess Saylara told me that, as we moved through narrow corridors carved from raw stone, lit by bioluminescent moss that gave everything a faint green glow. The lysantite walls had given way to something rougher and more ancient, and the air down here was cool and damp and tasted like mineral water. She moved fast for someone in ceremonial robes. After the first 100 meters, she tore the trailing fabric away without hesitation and kept going, barefoot on the cold stone. I stayed 3 steps behind her, the stolen pulse pistol in my right hand, my left hand against the wall to steady myself in the dim light. Every junction, every turn, every doorway was a potential ambush point, and I cleared each one the way I had been trained: quick look, weapon up, then move. "How many exits does this tunnel system have?" I asked. 7, she said without looking back, but only 3 that House Caliph would not know about. "Take us to one of those 3. She cut left at the next junction without slowing down. The tunnel narrowed, and the moss grew thicker on the walls. I could hear water somewhere, a steady drip that echoed in the enclosed space and made it impossible to tell if there were footsteps behind us. I asked her about the guards in the hall, the ones who had been repositioning before the attack. She confirmed what I already suspected. House Caliph had infiltrated the palace security months ago, replacing loyalist guards with their own operatives in a slow, quiet rotation that nobody caught because nobody was looking for it. The wedding had been the endgame from the beginning, not a union, an execution. "Draven never intended to marry you," I said. "No," she replied. "He intended to end my bloodline." She said it with a flatness that I found unsettling, not because it was cold, but because it was practiced. Like she had spent time imagining this possibility and had already processed the grief before it arrived. I wondered how long she had suspected. I wondered if that look she gave me during the ceremony had been her way of reaching out to the only person in the room who was not part of the script. We reached a heavy stone door, sealed with a biometric lock. Saylara pressed her hand against the panel, and it opened with a grinding sound that was far too loud for comfort. Beyond it was a wider corridor, clearly maintained and recently used, with overhead lighting and a smooth floor. "This leads to the Western Garrison," she said. "If any of my father's guard remained loyal, they will have fallen back there." "And if they did not?" She met my eyes. "Then we are alone." We were not alone. The garrison was occupied, but not by loyalist guards. As we approached the final corridor before the garrison entrance, I heard voices. Vathari voices, speaking in low, clipped tones that my translator struggled to render in real time. Military communication, orders being given, positions being confirmed. I pulled Saylara back and pressed us both against the wall. I held up my hand for silence, then crept forward to the edge of the corridor and looked. 6 armed Vathari in House Kalith colors. They had already taken the garrison. 2 were standing guard at the entrance, while the other 4 were inside, and from the sounds of it, they were methodically executing anyone they found wearing the Vorani crest. I pulled back and looked at the princess. 6 hostiles, 1 stolen pistol with an unknown charge level, and a corridor with no cover. The math was not in our favor. "Is there another route?" I whispered. She thought for a moment, then nodded. "There is a service passage that connects to the old water treatment facility beneath the eastern wing. From there, we can reach the tunnels that lead outside the palace grounds entirely." "How far?" 20 minutes on foot. I checked the charge indicator on the pulse pistol. I could not read the Vathari numerals, but the bar was less than half full. "Then we go fast and we go quiet." She led me through a series of passages that got progressively narrower and older. Some of them had not been used in decades, judging by the dust and the state of the moss growth on the walls. At one point, we had to squeeze through a gap in a partially collapsed section where the ancient stonework had shifted, and I scraped both shoulders getting through. The princess, being thinner and more flexible, slipped through with barely a pause. I could hear distant sounds through the stone. Explosions, muffled but distinct. The sharp crack of pulse weapons. Alarms that warbled at frequencies just outside comfortable human hearing. The palace above us was being torn apart, and we were moving through its bones like rats fleeing a burning building. "Who else survived?" I asked during a brief rest in a junction where 2 tunnels met. "From your family." Saylara was quiet for a long time. "My father is dead. I saw the wound. It was not survivable." She paused. "My mother was hit, but she was breathing when they pulled her out. My brother Kale was not in the hall. He was on the orbital station overseeing fleet maneuvers. If Kalith has not taken the station, he may still be alive. And if they have taken it? Then I am the last of the Vorani bloodline, and everything my family built over 4,000 years ends today." I did not have a response to that. What do you say to a woman who just watched her father die and her world collapse, while standing in a dark tunnel in bare feet with blood on her face? Nothing useful. So I said nothing, and we kept moving. 20 minutes became 30. The service passages were more degraded than Saylara had expected, and twice we had to backtrack when a tunnel proved impassable. But she knew the layout with a precision that suggested she had studied these routes before, maybe for exactly this kind of scenario. Smart. The kind of smart that keeps you alive when everything else falls apart. We emerged into a natural cavern that opened onto the surface through a crack in the hillside behind the palace. The night air hit me like a wall, warm and heavy, and carrying the smell of smoke from the palace fires. From our vantage point, I could see the western wing of the palace burning, orange flames licking up the lycanthite walls and turning them into something that looked like a dying star. Saylara stood beside me and watched her home burn. She did not cry, she did not shake. She stood very still, and the firelight played across her face, and her violet eyes reflected the flames with a clarity that was almost painful to look at. "We need to reach the loyalist houses," she said. "House Morthane, House Valderis, House Quenthar, and House Silanthi. They have forces. They have ships. If I can reach them before Draven consolidates control, there is still a chance. How far are they? House Morthane has a compound 30 kilometers north. If we can reach their perimeter, they will take us in. 30 kilometers. On foot, through terrain I did not know, on a world I had been on for less than 48 hours. With a half-charged alien pistol and a princess in torn ceremonial robes. I had survived worse odds. Barely, but I had survived them. Then we walk, I said. And we did. The walk to House Morthane's compound took 6 hours. We moved through dense forest, following a path that Saylara navigated from memory, using landmarks that were invisible to me, but apparently as clear as road signs to her. Twice we heard Kalith patrol craft overhead, their engines a distinctive high-pitched whine that cut through the night air. Both times we pressed ourselves flat against the ground beneath the canopy and waited until they passed. I kept the pulse pistol in my hand the entire time, my thumb on what I had determined through experimentation was the safety release. Saylara did not complain. Not once. Not about her bare feet on rough ground. Not about the cold. Not about the cuts on her arms from the tunnel collapse. She moved with a quiet determination that I respected deeply, because I had served with soldiers who had less composure under less pressure. Whatever else she was, this woman was not fragile. During the second hour, she told me about the political landscape. The Vaethari Dominion was governed by 12 noble houses, bound together by a complex web of blood treaties, marriage pacts, and mutual defense agreements. House Vorani had held the throne for the last 400 years, and the wedding to Lord Draven had been arranged specifically to end a generations-long Cold War between Vorani and Kalith. The other 10 houses had aligned themselves based on old loyalties and recent grievances, and the balance of power had always been precarious. What had happened tonight was not just a coup. It was the shattering of a political order that had held a dominion of 800 billion souls together for centuries. 5 houses are backing Draven, she said. They announced their support within minutes of the attack, which means the declarations were pre-written. 3 houses will remain neutral. They always do. They wait to see who wins and then pledge loyalty to the survivor. That leaves 4 houses loyal to the crown. That is a minority, I said. Yes, she agreed, but it is a minority with a fleet. House Morthane alone commands enough warships to contest the orbital grid. The problem is not firepower. The problem is authority. She explained it as we walked, and the more she explained, the more I understood just how deeply trapped they were. Vaethari law was absolute, rigid, and ancient. The Dominion's military could only be commanded by a crowned sovereign. No exceptions, no workarounds, no emergency provisions. The admirals, no matter how loyal, could not fire a single shot without a lawful order from someone who held the legal authority of the throne. And every person in the direct line of succession had been in that ceremonial hall when the shooting started. Your brother, I said, Kale, he is in the succession line. He is. If he is alive, if Kalith has not taken the orbital station, if he can be reached, she paused. That is a great many conditions. And if none of them are met? Then the Loyalist fleet sits in orbit and watches, while Draven takes the throne by default. Vaethari law gives a usurper 72 hours to be challenged by a legitimate claimant. After that, the seizure becomes legal, permanent, and binding. Every Loyalist commander, every house that stood with my family, every citizen who opposed Kalith, will be subject to Draven's authority, and Draven does not forgive. We reached the perimeter of House Morthane's compound, as the first light of dawn was turning the violet sky a pale silver. The compound was a fortress, low and heavy and built from dark stone, surrounded by energy barriers and patrolled by armed guards who tracked our approach with weapons raised. Saylara identified herself. There was a long, tense moment where the guards conferred via encrypted comms, and I could see the uncertainty in their movements. They had heard about the attack. They knew the king was dead, but they had not expected the princess to walk out of the darkness barefoot and bleeding, accompanied by an alien in a torn green uniform carrying a stolen gun. The gates opened. Inside, the compound was a controlled frenzy of activity. Military officers were coordinating with the other Loyalist houses via secure channels. Holographic displays showed the orbital situation in real time. House Kalith had seized the primary defense grid, and was using it to establish a blockade around the planet. 3 of Draven's allied houses had moved their fleets into supporting positions. The Loyalist houses had pulled their forces back to defensive postures, waiting for orders that nobody had the legal authority to give. We were brought to a council chamber where the heads of the 4 Loyalist houses had already gathered. Lord Morthane was ancient even by Vaethari standards, his amber skin weathered to the color of old leather, his silver-flecked eyes sharp and cold. Beside him stood Lady Veldaris, younger and visibly agitated, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. The representatives from House Quenthar and House Silanthe were present via holographic projection, their images flickering slightly with the strain on the encrypted channels. They looked at Saylara with a mixture of relief and despair. She was alive. That was good. But alive and powerless were not very different when the law required a crowned sovereign, and every crown was either dead or unreachable. "We have attempted to contact Prince Kale," Lord Morthane said, his voice deep and rough like gravel shifting. "The orbital station is not responding. Our intelligence suggests Kalith forces boarded it within minutes of the attack. We must assume the worst." Saylara received this news with a stillness that I was beginning to recognize as her version of absorbing a blow. A brief pause, a tightening around her eyes, and then forward motion. "Then we must find another way," she said. "There is no other way," Lady Veldaris said. "The succession is clear. Without a legitimate heir, the law does not permit us to act. We cannot crown you directly. Your marriage was the mechanism for your ascension, and the marriage was never completed." And that was when Saylara turned to me. I did not understand the look at first. I thought she was checking on me, making sure I was still standing, still functional. But the look lasted too long, and it carried too much calculation. "There is one other mechanism," she said, still looking at me. "The right of witness." Lord Morthane's expression shifted. I watched it happen in real time. Confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been horror. "No," he said. "That is not possible." "It is law," Saylara replied. "Article 7 of the Founding Compact. The living shield who stands behind the bride during the blood vow is bound to the royal house by the same oath that binds the intended. If the intended betrays the bride before the vow is sealed, the shield-bearer's claim supersedes the betrayer's." The room went very quiet. Every pair of silver-flecked eyes turned toward me, and I stood there in my torn dress uniform with a stolen gun in my belt, bleeding from a cut on my forehead that I had not noticed until that moment. And I realized with a clarity that felt like stepping off a cliff that they were talking about me. "No," I said. "No, that is not happening." "Sergeant Maddox," Saylara said, and her voice had a quality to it that I had not heard before. Not pleading, not commanding, something in between. "I am not asking you to be a king. I am asking you to be a legal claim with a heartbeat." "I change oil on transport rigs," I said. "I pull guard shifts on cargo ships. I do not run alien empires. You do not need to run anything. You need to exist, legally, in a position that allows me to invoke sovereign authority through proxy. You stand as claimant. I act as regent. The Loyalist fleet receives lawful orders, and 800 billion people do not wake up tomorrow under the rule of the man who murdered my father." Lady Veldaris was shaking her head. "The compact is clear on the mechanism, but it has never been tested, never invoked, and it was certainly never intended to apply to a non-Vaethari." "The compact does not specify species," Saylara said. "I have read it, many times. The language refers to the shield-bearer, without qualification. Any shield-bearer who stood and was recognized during the right of witness holds the claim." "He was recognized," Lord Morthane said, slowly, as if the words were being dragged out of him. "The ceremony proceeded with him in position. The officiant acknowledged all 42 shield-bearers by species and name before the vow began. It is in the record." I looked around the room at alien faces that were watching me, with expressions ranging from desperate hope to barely concealed contempt. 4 ancient noble houses, the remnants of a shattered government, and a princess with bare feet and fire in her eyes, and all of them were looking at a human sergeant from the logistics division as though I held the future of their civilization in my hands. I held up those hands. They were scraped, dirty, and one of them was still trembling slightly from the adrenaline that had not fully left my system since the shooting started. "If I do this," I said, "what happens to Draven?" "He will be charged with regicide, treason, and violation of the blood vow," Saylara said. "The penalty under Vathari law is severe." That is not what I asked. I asked what happens to him specifically. Do I get to be in the room when it happens? Saylara looked at me for a long moment, and through the grief, through the exhaustion, through the weight of a world collapsing around her, something flickered across her face that might have been the ghost of a smile. "I think that can be arranged," she said. I sat down on the nearest bench. It was too tall for me, designed for Vathari proportions, and my feet dangled slightly off the floor. I looked ridiculous. I felt ridiculous. A human sitting in an alien war room with his feet not touching the ground, being asked to become a king. I thought about my bunk on the transport ship. I thought about the 12-page briefing packet, and the instructions to smile when protocol required it. I thought about the look in Saylara's eyes during the ceremony, that half-second of fear that had told me everything I needed to know before the first shot was fired. "Fine," I said. "What do I have to do?" The answer, it turned out, was not simple. Lord Morthane informed me that while the legal mechanism existed, invoking it required the claimant to pass the trial of claim, an ancient rite designed to test whether a challenger was fit to hold sovereign authority. It was not a test of blood or birthright. It was a test of judgment, decision-making under pressure, with real consequences for failure. "What kind of consequences?" I asked. "If you fail," Morthane said, "the tribunal has the authority to execute you on the spot." I let that sink in for a moment. "And if I refuse to take the trial?" "Then no claim is recognized, no sovereign authority exists, and Draven's seizure becomes legal in approximately 61 hours. I looked at Saylara. She looked back at me. There was no pressure in her expression, no manipulation. She was giving me the choice. Full information, full awareness of the stakes, and full freedom to walk away. I have never been particularly brave. I want to be clear about that. I am not the kind of man who runs toward danger because it thrills me. I run toward it because someone trained me to, and because every time I have faced a moment where I could either move or freeze, my body has chosen to move without consulting my brain first. That is not courage. That is conditioning. But in that moment, sitting in an alien council chamber with my feet dangling off a bench, it was enough. "Set it up," I said. The trial was convened within the hour, in a chamber beneath the Morthane compound that had been built specifically for this purpose centuries ago. It was circular, with tiered stone seating surrounding a central platform where the claimant was required to stand. The heads of the 4 loyalist houses sat in judgment. Saylara stood to the side as witness. I stood in the center, under lights that were too bright and in front of faces that did not want me there. Lord Morthane presided. He explained the rules in a tone that suggested he was performing a duty he found personally distasteful. 3 scenarios would be presented. Each one was drawn from actual Vathari historical crises. I would be given the facts of the situation and required to render a decision within 30 seconds. The decisions would be evaluated not by whether they matched the historical outcome, but by whether they demonstrated sovereign judgment, the ability to weigh competing interests, accept consequences, and act decisively in the absence of perfect information. "You may begin when ready," Morthane said. I was not ready. I said, "Go." The first scenario was projected as a holographic display around me, immersing me in the tactical situation. A Vathari colony world was under siege. The enemy had established an orbital blockade and was systematically destroying infrastructure. The colony's military garrison could hold for approximately 6 more hours. A relief fleet was available, but would take 14 hours to arrive. I had 2 options: commit the garrison to a defensive stand and accept the losses until relief arrived, or order an immediate civilian evacuation through a secondary corridor that would require abandoning the colony's industrial sector and its strategic resources. I did not hesitate. Evacuate the civilians, all of them. Every transport, every shuttle, every ship that can carry a living body gets loaded and launched through the secondary corridor now. The industrial sector is metal and concrete. You can rebuild metal and concrete. You cannot rebuild the dead. The chamber was silent. Lord Morthane made a notation on his tablet. His expression revealed nothing. The second scenario appeared. A senior member of a noble house had been discovered feeding intelligence to an enemy power. The evidence was conclusive, obtained through intercepted communications. The traitor's family, a spouse and 3 children, had no knowledge of the betrayal. Vathari precedent called for the execution of the traitor and the exile of the entire family line, stripping them of name, title, and assets. The traitor faces trial and sentencing, according to the evidence, I said. The family is investigated independently. If they had no knowledge and no involvement, they keep their name, their home, and their standing. You do not punish children for the sins of their parents. The day you start doing that is the day you stop being a government and start being a gang. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Lady Veldaris leaned forward in her seat, her expression unreadable. The third scenario materialized, and this one was different. The tactical display showed a fleet engagement. A loyalist force outnumbered 3-1 against a superior enemy. Retreat was possible, but would cede a strategically vital system. Direct engagement would result in the destruction of the loyalist fleet. There appeared to be no viable option between total sacrifice and total withdrawal. I stared at the display. I studied the positioning of the enemy fleet, their formation, their approach vectors, and I saw something. The enemy formation has a seam, I said. Here. I pointed to a gap between the enemy's 2nd and 3rd squadrons, where their coverage overlapped, but their fields of fire created a narrow blind corridor. They are in a classic envelopment pattern, but they have optimized for preventing retreat, not for absorbing a charge. If the loyalist fleet concentrates its entire force into a single spearhead and drives through that seam at maximum acceleration, they will pass through the enemy formation before it can collapse inward. The enemy has to choose between pursuing, which breaks their formation, or maintaining position, which lets the loyalist fleet reform behind them and attack from the rear. Either way, the numerical advantage is neutralized because the fight becomes sequential, not simultaneous. The silence that followed was different from the others. Heavier. I watched Lord Morthane's face and saw something shift behind his eyes. Not approval exactly. Recognition. The recognition of a mind that thinks about problems in a way his culture does not expect. He stepped backward. One full step. And the elder of House Quenthar, watching via hologram, slowly rose from his seat. I have a question for the claimant, the Quenthar elder said. If the spearhead fails and the fleet is destroyed, what then? Then the fleet is destroyed doing something instead of nothing, I said, and the enemy knows that the next time they set a trap, the thing inside it might bite through the cage. Fear is a strategic resource. You do not create it by retreating. The vote was conducted in silence. Each househead entered their judgment on a sealed tablet. Morthane collected them, reviewed them, and looked up at me with an expression I could not fully read. The trial is passed, he said. The claim is recognized. One by one, the 4 loyalist househeads rose from their seats and knelt, not to me, to the law, to the ancient mechanism that they had sworn to uphold even when it produced an outcome that none of them wanted. I stood on the central platform of an alien tribunal chamber, a human being in a ruined dress uniform, and watched 4 of the most powerful people in the Vathari Dominion lower themselves to the ground in front of me. Selara stepped forward. She was carrying something wrapped in cloth, and when she unwrapped it, I saw a ring. Heavy, gold, set with a stone that shifted colors like oil on water, the dead king's signet, his seal of authority, the object that represented, in physical form, the legal right to command the Vathari Dominion's military forces. She placed it on my hand. It was too large, designed for Vathari fingers, which were longer and thinner than human ones. It sat loose on my ring finger, and I had to curl my hand into a partial fist to keep it from sliding off. It did not fit. Nothing about this fit, but I wore it anyway. You need to contact the fleet, Selara said. The sovereign command frequency is reserved for the crowned authority. When you transmit on that channel, every ship in the Dominion's navy will hear you. I looked at the communications console that Morthane's staff had prepared. It was a simple interface, even by alien standards. One button to transmit, one channel to reach every admiral, every captain, every crew member in the Vathari military simultaneously. I pressed the button. "This is Cale Maddox," I said. "Sergeant, Earth Unified Forces. Acting Sovereign of the Vathari Dominion, by right of the right of witness. Article 7 of the Founding Compact, confirmed by the trial of claim, under the judgment of Houses Morthane, Veldaris, Quenthar, and Salanthi." I paused. "I need a fleet. I need it armed, formed, and ready to move within 4 hours. Any ship that is loyal to House Vorani and the rule of law, respond on this channel. I do not have time for speeches, and I do not have time for debate. You know what happened tonight. You know who did it. Now you have someone with the legal right to do something about it. Maddox out." I released the button. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted. Then the channel lit up. The first response came from Admiral Sithara of House Morthane's fleet. A voice like hammered iron, clipped and precise. "Flagship Ascendant confirms. Awaiting coordinates." The second came 4 seconds later from the Veldaris carrier group, then Quenthar, then Salanthi, then ships I had not expected, independent vessels, merchant marine captains, even a retired destroyer commander who had pulled his ship out of mothballs and was running on a skeleton crew of veterans who had heard the broadcast and reported for duty without being asked. In 18 minutes, the Loyalist fleet had assembled the largest coordinated naval force in Vathari history. 147 warships, ranging from light corvettes to the Morthane dreadnought Ascendant, all responding to a single transmission from a human sergeant wearing a ring that did not fit. Saylara stood beside me, watching the fleet indicators populate the tactical display one by one. Each new signal was a green dot on the holographic map, and the map was filling up like a sky full of emerging stars. "You did that," she said quietly. "I pressed a button," I said. "They did the rest." "You pressed the right button, at the right time, in the right way." She looked at me. "That is what sovereignty is." I wanted to argue with her. I wanted to say that sovereignty was bloodlines, and tradition, and the weight of history, not a logistics sergeant in a borrowed ring. But I did not argue, because the fleet was forming up, and Draven was still out there, and whatever philosophical debate I wanted to have about the nature of leadership could wait until after we had taken back a planet. I turned to the tactical display and studied the enemy positions. Draven had consolidated his forces around the palace and the orbital defense grid, forming a defensive perimeter that was designed to hold against a conventional siege. He had the grid's weapons platforms, he had the palace's shielding, and he had the political cover of a claim that he would argue was legitimate until someone with greater legal authority said otherwise. His strategy was clear: hold position, wait for the 72-hour window to expire, and let Vathari law do the rest. He was not expecting a counterstrike. Not this fast. Not from a fleet that had been leaderless 6 hours ago. And he certainly was not expecting the orders to come from a human. I did not command from the rear. That was not a strategic decision. That was stubbornness. Saylara argued against it. Morthane told me it was unnecessary, but I had spent my entire career watching officers send people into situations they themselves would never face. And I had sworn a long time ago that if I ever had the authority to give an order that might get people killed, I would be standing close enough to share the risk. So I was on the bridge of the Ascendant when the fleet moved. The bridge was vast, designed for a Vathari command crew, and I was the smallest person in the room by at least a foot. Admiral Sithara had given me a position at the command rail, where the Sovereign traditionally stood during fleet actions. I stood there, holding on to a rail that was too high for me with one hand, and keeping the signet ring from falling off with the other, and watched through the forward display as 147 ships accelerated toward a fight. Draven's fleet was arranged in a defensive hemisphere around the orbital grid, weapons platforms angled outward, with interdiction fields designed to slow any incoming force to a crawl. It was a strong position, the kind of position that a textbook would call nearly impregnable. I am not a textbook reader. The Vathari commanders had proposed a distributed assault, multiple attack vectors to spread the defensive fire and probe for weaknesses. It was sound doctrine. It was also exactly what Draven would expect, because it was what any Vathari admiral would do. I suggested something different. Concentrate the fleet, I said. All of it. Single column, tight formation, Maximum thrust. Aim for the junction between the third and fourth weapons platforms on the grid's southern arc. Admiral Sithara looked at me like I had suggested flying into a star. That corridor is within the firing solution of 6 defensive batteries. We would be under concentrated fire for the entire approach. Yes, I said. But those batteries are automated. They track targets based on threat algorithms that prioritize distributed threats. A single concentrated column will confuse the tracking solution because the system is designed to engage multiple targets simultaneously, not one dense formation. It will waste critical seconds, reassigning targeting priorities, and those seconds are the window. Sithara studied the tactical display. I watched her run the calculation in her head, and I watched the moment when she realized I was right. Automated defense systems are optimized for the most likely scenario. The most likely scenario is a distributed attack. Nobody drives an entire fleet through a single point because it is insane. Which is exactly why it works, because the defense algorithm does not account for insanity. All ships, Sithara transmitted, form on the ascendant, single column, close formation, all power to forward shields. The fleet moved like a spear. Draven saw it coming. His response was immediate and predictable. He broadcast a galaxy-wide transmission on every open channel, and his voice was smooth, controlled, and dripping with outraged authority. Citizens of the Dominion and representatives of the Galactic Compact, I address you as the rightful sovereign of the Vaethari people. The fleet approaching my position is commanded by a human, an alien species with no claim to Vaethari governance, who has seized authority through a manipulation of ancient law. This is not a legitimate challenge. This is an invasion. I call upon every civilized species to condemn this act and impose sanctions on all parties supporting this illegal seizure of power. It was a good speech, politically savvy, emotionally calibrated, designed to turn the narrative from coup leader to defender of sovereignty. If it worked, the neutral houses would flip to his side, the galactic community would apply pressure, and the loyalist fleet would be forced to stand down, regardless of its military advantage. Saylara was beside me on the bridge. She heard the broadcast, and I saw the calculation in her eyes. She knew the stakes. He is reframing the narrative, she said. If the galaxy sees a human commanding a Vaethari fleet, it confirms his version of events. Then we reframe it back, I said. I did not make a speech. Speeches are for people who have time, and we had approximately 8 minutes before the fleet reached firing range of the defense grid. Instead, I opened a channel to every diplomatic delegation that had attended the wedding, all 42 species, every ambassador, every envoy, every representative who had been in that hall when the lights went out and the shooting started, and I transmitted the raw security footage. Not edited, not narrated, just the footage, the ceremony proceeding normally, the shield bearers in position, the blood vow reaching its final words. Then the lights cutting, the first shot hitting the king, the queen falling, Draven stepping away from his bride with choreographed precision, walking toward the exit, while his operatives fired from the balconies. Noble after noble falling. Guests screaming, stampede. And then one figure moving. One person in the entire hall who did not freeze, did not run, did not look for cover. A human in a green dress uniform who grabbed the princess, pulled her to safety, picked up a weapon, and started shooting back. I let the footage play for 45 seconds. Then I cut in. My name is Kale Maddox. I was the Terran shield bearer at this wedding. I did not come here to take a throne. I came here because someone sent an invitation, and nobody sent a warning. The man who just asked you to condemn me is the same man you watched step away from his bride while his soldiers murdered her family. You saw the footage. You saw him walk. He walked away from a woman he swore to protect, and I walked toward her. That is the only fact that matters today. I closed the channel. The fleet hit the defense grid 40 seconds later. As I had predicted, the automated batteries fumbled the targeting solution. Instead of the coordinated barrage that would have shredded a distributed attack, the weapons platforms fired in staggered, confused bursts, reassigning targets mid-sequence as their algorithms tried to process a formation type they had not been programmed to expect. We lost shields on 3 ships. We lost 1 corvette to a direct hit that punched through, before the targeting error corrected. But the column held, and we were through the gap before the system adapted. Inside the defensive perimeter, the battle was brief and one-sided. Draven's fleet was positioned for a siege, not a close engagement. Our ships emerged behind their formation and hit them from angles they had not prepared for. The Loyalist fleet fought with a ferocity that surprised even their own commanders, and I understood why. These were crews who had watched their king die, their princess flee, and their dominion shatter in a single night. They were not fighting for a human sovereign. They were fighting for a law that said what happened tonight was wrong, and someone was going to answer for it. The neutral houses flipped within the first hour of the engagement. The security footage had done its work. 3 houses that had been content to sit on the sideline and wait for a winner suddenly found their communications channels flooded with demands from their own populations. The Vathari people had seen the footage too, and whatever Draven had said in his broadcast, the image of a groom walking away from his dying father-in-law while an alien stranger fought to save the bride was not something that rhetoric could erase. One by one, Draven's coalition fractured. 2 houses withdrew their support and pulled their fleets back. A third attempted to surrender and was accepted. The remaining 2 houses fought on for another 30 minutes before their admirals mutinied and turned their ships over to the Loyalist command. Draven himself was captured, attempting to flee aboard a diplomatic shuttle. He had removed his ceremonial robes and was wearing the uniform of a merchant crew, a disguise so pathetic that it would have been funny if the stakes had not been so high. Vathari Marines pulled him from the cockpit and marched him through the Ascendant's corridors. As they passed the bridge, the lead Marine saluted me. Draven looked at me through the bridge viewport, and in his black eyes, I saw something I had been waiting to see since the moment I watched him walk away from Saylara at the altar. He looked afraid. Good. The 72 hours expired without challenge. The Loyalist fleet controlled the orbital grid. The palace was secured, its fires extinguished, its halls cleared of the dead and the debris. The neutral houses pledged their loyalty. Draven was in custody, along with the commanders of the 5 houses that had supported his coup. Legal proceedings were already being organized, and the Vathari judicial system, which was thorough and methodical in ways that made Earth's court systems look like casual suggestions, was preparing the largest treason trial in the Dominion's history. I stood in the throne room on the morning of the 3rd day. The room was damaged. Scorch marks on the walls, cracks in the lysantite pillars, a hole in the ceiling where a pulse bolt had punched through the crystal dome. The thrones were intact, though. They were carved from a single piece of dark stone that had survived the fighting without a scratch, as if the physical seats of power were harder than the violence that tried to destroy them. Saylara found me there. She had changed out of her torn ceremonial robes and was wearing something simpler, a dark blue dress that left her arms bare and showed the bandages on her forearms where the tunnel debris had cut her. Her feet were in actual shoes. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. "The Coronation Council has been convened," she said. "They are prepared to formalize your position." I looked at the thrones. 2 seats, side by side, one slightly larger than the other. The king's throne and the consort's throne. 4,000 years of Vorani rulers had sat there. "I am not sitting in that chair," I said. "It is your legal right." "It is my legal right to eat an entire cake by myself too, but that does not make it a good idea." I turned to face her. "This was always yours, Saylara. The crown, the dominion, the responsibility. I held the claim because the law needed someone to hold it. The law has been satisfied. Draven is finished, your position is secure. And I am a sergeant who needs to get back to his unit before someone marks me absent without leave." She studied me for a long time, those violet eyes, steady and searching, looking for something in my face that I was not sure I had. "You saved my life," she said. "You saved my people, and you want to go back to changing oil on transport ships." "Somebody has to change the oil," I said. "Those rigs do not maintain themselves." I signed the emergency abdication that afternoon. It was a simple document by Vathari standards, only 8 pages, transferring full sovereign authority to Princess Saylara Vorani, who would be crowned as reigning queen within the week. The Loyalist houses witnessed it, the galactic delegations were notified, and just like that, the shortest reign in Vathari history came to an end. 6 days. I held a crown for 6 days, and most of that time was spent either running through tunnels or standing on a bridge watching other people fight. The coronation of Queen Selara was held in the same hall where her wedding had been. The crystal dome had been repaired, the scorch marks had been polished away. New lysantite had been grown to replace the damaged sections, and it was lighter than the old stone, giving the repaired areas a slightly different hue that the Vaethari said they would leave as a permanent reminder. I attended in my dress uniform, a new one, issued by the Earth Embassy that had finally sent a proper diplomatic team once the dust settled. I stood in the back, near the exit, which is where logistics sergeants belong. 42 species provided shield bearers for the new ceremony. When it came time for the Terran representative to take position, the crowd expected me to step forward. I did not. A young lieutenant from the diplomatic corps took the spot instead. She was nervous, and she held her position with a stiffness that reminded me of my own stance 6 days earlier. But there was a difference this time. Beside the throne, offset to the left, a new chair had been placed. It was smaller than the thrones, carved from the same dark stone, but with a different design. The armrests were shaped like shields. It was the shield-bearer's chair, commissioned by Queen Selara, and placed in the throne room by her personal order. A permanent addition. A permanent reminder. No one sat in it during the coronation. No one has sat in it since. Selara told me it would remain empty for as long as the Dominion endured. A monument to the night, when an uninvited stranger stood between a princess and the dark. I left the Vaethari homeworld 2 days after the coronation. A transport ship picked me up from the orbital station, the same station where Prince Kale had been held captive by Kalith forces until the Loyalist Marines liberated it. Kale was alive, bruised and furious, but alive, and he had shaken my hand with a grip that nearly broke my fingers, and said words in Vaethari that my translator rendered as, "Brother in all things that matter." The ride home was quiet. I sat in the cargo hold because old habits die hard, and I watched the stars move past the viewport in that slow, steady drift that always made me feel like the universe was breathing. I went back to my unit. I went back to the 14th Logistics Division. I went back to changing oil on transport rigs and pulling overnight guard shifts on cargo ships. My commanding officer never asked me about the assignment. The report I filed was 7 pages long and was probably read by exactly 2 people before being archived in a database that nobody would ever search. But sometimes, late at night, when the ship is quiet and the crew is sleeping and the only sound is the low hum of the engines, I catch myself looking at my right hand, the one that wore a ring for 6 days. The ring is gone. I gave it back. It sits in the throne room now, in a glass case beside the empty chair, and history books that I will never read in a language I cannot speak will record what it meant. I think about her sometimes, the woman with the violet eyes, who trusted a stranger with the future of her world. I think about the way she moved through those tunnels, barefoot and bleeding, with the composure of someone who had decided that the universe could throw whatever it wanted at her, and she would keep walking. I think about the look she gave me during the ceremony, that half-second of fear that started everything. I never told anyone the full story. My bunkmates know I attended an alien wedding. They do not know the rest. They do not know about the trial of claim or the fleet, or the spearhead through the defense grid. They do not know that for 6 days, a sergeant from the logistics division was the legal sovereign of 800 billion souls. Some ranks you carry quiet. Some things you do not put in a report. And some nights, when the stars are moving past the viewport, and the universe feels very large and very indifferent, you look at your empty hand, and remember what it felt like to hold something that did not belong to you but needed you to hold it anyway. That is the story. That is all of it. I was a soldier who walked into a wedding and walked out wearing a crown that did not fit. I gave it back because it was never mine, but the weight of it, the strange, impossible, terrifying weight of it, that I kept. You do not put that down. You do not forget what it feels like to stand in the gap and find out what you are made of, when nobody is watching, and nobody will ever know. My name is Cale Maddox, Sergeant, Earth Unified Forces, 14th Logistics Division. I change oil on transport rigs. I pull guard shifts on cargo ships. And for 6 days, in a palace made of frozen lightning on a world 52 light-years from home, I was a king. But I was a soldier first. That is the part that matters.